Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner with the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we take another look at the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, this time retracing the 19th century survey responsible for the only straight section of the border. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Leading the charge once again into the weird border occurrences along the St. Louis River, I'm joined again by reporter Jimmy Lovrien. Jimmy, welcome back. Now on episode 40 of the podcast.
Hello, Wyatt, and happy 40th to you.
Yeah, so special notice, not only just because it's, episode 40, which is, higher, a good number to point out, but we're now kind of circling back, sort of like a sequel or a spin-off to your first story on the podcast back in episode 4, when you first look into the historic border dispute along the St. Louis River, where it's like a few parcels of land on what you would consider you would think was the Minnesota side of the border is actually technically Wisconsin. So if you're curious about that, check that out. It's episode 4. But now we're back again, looking along that same border, granted a different section of the border, and for a slightly different reason. But again, we're back at is becoming a more interesting, weird occurrences along our state border.
Exactly. We're further up the St. Louis River, still on the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, and we're trying to figure out why the border is the way it is. And we're guided here by Tony Luke. He's a surveyor. He helped us again with that 1921 U.S. Supreme Court border dispute that set the ultimately resolved the border and put a few parcels of land that you'd think are Duluth are actually in Superior, Wisconsin. So he gave me a call a few weeks ago and said, "Hey, it's going to be nice this week. Do you want to join me out on the river? I'm going to retrace another survey. Why don't you come tag along?" And I decided to, because it was kind of the interesting circumstances around just what this survey was and how it set the only straight section of Minnesota-Wisconsin border.
So where along the border is this straight section? How far are we talking here?
Yeah, it's a 40-mile section. So if you're looking at a map, it's the eastern section, and you'll notice it's almost all river, right? And that was intended. So up here, the border between Wisconsin and Minnesota is the St. Louis River. Yep. And then you get up to past what's now Chambers Grove Park in the Fond du Lac neighborhood of Duluth. And just under the dam, Minnesota Power's Fond du Lac Dam, it goes from following the river straight due south for 40 miles, and then until it hits the St. Croix River. Then it follows the St. Croix River, which flows into the Mississippi River, and that's the rest of the border. So, from, the corner of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all the way up, to here, the only section that's straight and not following a body of water is that 40-mile section. And where that began on the St. Louis River was up to George Stuntz. In 1852, he was set out to survey it, and he was kind of given some instructions on where to place that straight line south. And so that's where things kind of get interesting.
Yeah, so who was George Stuntz, and how did he pick where to put this straight section of the border?
Yeah. So George Stuntz is kind of considered the first permanent white settler of the Twin Ports of Duluth, and he was a surveyor who was tasked with this 1852 survey, but also he did a lot of the original surveys in Minnesota, Wisconsin, in this region here. The Vermilion Trail, which is now the road up to the Iron Range, but that's what many people took to get to the Vermilion Range, and the first things of iron. Some people credit him with discovering iron on the Vermilion Range. I don't know if I could go that far, if people could go that far. He definitely promoted it, though, and got people interested in mining on the Vermilion Range, which, preceded that of the Mesaba Range. There's all sorts of places, townships, towns that have been absorbed, I think, into Hibbing now, but places named after him because he had such an influential role in, deciding, where boundaries and lines should be, and then kind of being some of the, garnering interest among people who want to, make some money off that land. So that's George Stuntz, and he was tasked in 1852 with setting that straight, St. Louis River to St. Croix River border. And his instructions were that it should be quote, commencing in the main channel of the St. Louis River at the first rapids in the same above the Indian village. Okay.
Okay.
So there was an Indian village just kind of where Chambers Grove Park, we'll simplify it, about where Chambers Grove Park was, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe a little past. But he was told, okay, once you pass that village, you get to the first rapids, that's where you draw the line south.
Okay.
Okay. Well, he gets there and the water's high. He recounted this decades later to some educators on a train that then wrote about it in their education journal. Anyway, so he gets there, the water's high, doesn't actually know where the first rapids are. So he takes it upon himself to take one canoe paddle, just him in the canoe, and then paddle up that section where he could tell that there's strong current. The rapids must be under there somewhere. And where he could go no further with his his canoe could go no further with his, just him paddling, that's where he decided the first rapids were. And from that point, he drew a line straight south. Well, and surveyed the line straight south until he got to the St. Croix River. And that's how that straight section of border came to be.
And why is there a straight section? Like, why was he given instructions to decide that there should be a straight section where he should place that? Like, why is there a random straight section?
Yeah, they wanted a water border, but there just wasn't a river to border to serve as the border in that section. So that was kind of filling the gap that they wanted. They wanted, if there was a river in between, they probably would have used that, but there just wasn't, so they made a straight line. But
okay.
Yeah. And so Tony, the surveyor today, he retraced this survey and what Stuntz did 171 years ago. He would have kind of made some positions off over on what's now Barker's Island. He would have kind of triangulated his location, sighting off of Minnesota Point and Wisconsin Point, right? You can get in, ships can get in there. And so he sighted off those, triangulated himself. Anyway, and then kind of kept doing that at certain landmarks and trees and things along the way until he made it, over the course of 4 days, made it up past what's now Chambers Grove Park. There he could kind of, find and position and record where exactly this border was going to be. So Tony is part surveyor, part historian, and he has delved into several of these before. We've talked to him for the 1921 U.S. Supreme Court border, and now this one, he's done this one, and so he wanted to get out there and kind of see the points that Stuntz would have stopped at, looked, kind of seen the sight lines, that he would have seen, and then kind of work his way through. And so that's what we did. And instead of taking 4 days, it took 6 hours or so in a motorboat. And so that was pretty cool. He, kind of part of what he does is research the history of it, and so he's saying, right here, there would have been a trading post, here on Park Point, and then Stuntz used that as one of his points to kind of triangulate his location, and so he's kind of researched that a bit. He went down there to try to find it, GPS, because he's kind of transferred all of these points over to GPS. So he goes over there and finds out that, it actually would have been like 200 feet into the bay, because, the landscape of the harbor and the bay and the river have changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. And so, what used to be land or marshland had been dug up and moved away to make room for shipping and stuff. And so, he's kind of got these little different bits and pieces of history along the way. And although the landscape has changed dramatically, there's tons of infill docks industry that weren't there 170 years ago, but they, you could still kind of get a sense of in some places would have been pretty close. I mean, we went to an island that he would have surveyed off of, which had probably changed shapes due to erosion and everything some, but we were, it was a very tiny island, and it was, part of the survey at the time. So there were kind of those types of things that were pretty cool to see along the way.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, what was your experience like for you going out and being a part of this retracement? because you said it was like a 6-hour day. You try to rope me and photographer Jed Carlson back into it, and like I would have, but that's a long day, and I had a lot of other podcasts and projects to edit. It was unfortunate timing for me to have to try to block out that chunk of day.
Yeah.
But what was the experience like for you? And I imagine also kind of cold too.
It wasn't terrible. We picked, thankfully, like the nicest week in November, which now it's like 11 degrees outside. But 2 weeks ago, it got up to like the 50s, I think, that when we were out there. And so we got out. By the time we got the little 2-stroke engine started, it was probably 10-ish, 9:30, 10 a.m. Mm-hmm. So it was a little chilly, as we buzzed over to Barker's Island, but the sun was out. It was nice. It was a really nice day out on the water. It was calm. Yeah, we picked a good day. So it was a good way to spend a work day. But yeah, it was cool. We had Peter from the Spirit Lake Marina there, who, Spirit Lake Marina, back to our episode 4.
Another throwback a little bit. They're the impacted party of the
exactly.
weird border.
They're on an old shipbuilding, couple of docks that are artificially made in Phil, and the very tips of them are actually in Wisconsin, which you'd think everything was in Minnesota. So anyway, so Peter helped kind of guide us through. He's very familiar with the St. Louis, and so he was able to help us avoid all the low spots and navigate through the channel and everything like that. But it was cool to see. We went on a couple islands. We found kind of the points that Stunts would have used and the sight lines he would have seen. And then just before sunset, we made it we couldn't quite make it around the bend over to the base of Fond du Lac Dam. I mean, it gets pretty shallow. There's rapids. We turned around about at Chambers Grove Park, which was good. We were running out of daylight, and I don't know if you can really get a boat. Maybe, I think canoe probably, but I don't know how much you want to try that.
Mm-hmm. And why did Tony want to retrace this borderline? I know he's got an interest in land surveying as a land surveyor himself,
right,
and such, but what prompted him to pursue this specific retracement?
Yeah. I think he has always been just interested in all of this, and so I think he really wanted to see what Stunts would have seen. Kind of get to that point and look one way. Oh, he would have used a tree up there on that bluff and something down over there, and he would have triangulated his position off those. I think he wanted to see that because he had spent tons and tons and tons of time in archives finding that map that came out of that 1852 survey, finding the different survey books. He found one of the maps at the National Archives in DC and had them send a scan of it. Well, it wasn't in great condition, so he put it online, put it on his computer, traced it, geo-referenced some points and everything, and he, like the 1921 survey, there's an error in there, and he wants to sort out why the error exists. So I think for him, he even said it. He described it as, now it's become an obsession. Well, a passion, really. So I think
it's funny how the two are so close together.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, for him, this surveying is kind of a lens into more history, right? I mean, it's not just the survey or the mechanics of it. He's researching the biography of George Stunts, the biographical information of him, what was happening at the time. He's looking up court cases and other things, and it's very much, and then you get to go outside and go actually kind of walk where they walked, look at what they looked. And so it's kind of a mix of the two. And so for him, I think, these survey stakes and monuments that maybe we don't really think much of, for him, there's stories behind those, and he's very dedicated to telling those stories and learning more about those. So that was cool. I mean, it's fun anytime you get someone who's excited about what they do, it's fun to talk to them. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, for one example, I mean, where Stunts would have picked, the due straight south line from the St. Louis River, he used a big, I think it was a yellow pine, up on a bluff that happened to be straight south of where he decided the rapids were. Well, that tree's not there anymore, but its stump is. And there's a new monument stake marked there, and that's the first, monument along that 40-mile section of border. And so that's still there today. Tony has found that. The stake itself was replaced in the 70s by the Minnesota DNR. But that's still there. The stump is still there, right? And so 170 years, not only are some of the geographies the same, like, oh, that bluff, that whatever. Well, we've got like the stump of a tree that was actually used to decide where the border was still there.
Mm-hmm. So with all this, because you mentioned before, Tony found an error in that 1921 land draw. Mm-hmm. Did he find any errors this time?
Yeah, and I'm honestly not. I don't understand it fully, but there's like a 3,000 or so foot gap that was made. Like there's just like a missing 3,000 feet, and everyone was able to kind of just deal with it at the time. I think I'm probably maybe misrepresenting or oversimplifying it a bit, but it was essentially like there's a 3,000 feet along I think if I'm understanding it right, there's like a straight line section where maybe you know what, let's skip this question.
You're trying to tell me that you don't understand the full nuances of land surveying and border drawing?
I think
you're trying to tell me that's not your full expertise?
That you'd think by now I would, but I just
after two stories, like well over 6 months apart, you still haven't figured it out.
I still haven't figured it out. It's really interesting though. I do appreciate it. I like the kind of the more digital side of things, trying to make maps and GIS. I do a little bit of that. I try to do a little bit of that in my work. So I'm interested in that aspect of it. But then to get on the ground and how it works now, even back then, I mean that's kind of crazy. Yeah. It's cool, but I do not get it.
I mean, there's different levels of interest. Understand, like, say, like I have an interest and a passion for cameras and stuff, and like I know the inner workings of that. But there's a whole other level of like you're getting to the real nitty gritty specs and the tech stuff. I'm like, oh, that's where there's a certain point where your knowledge just kind of drops off. You're like, well, you've lost me now. I had everything else until that point, and I'm interested in it, but like, man, that's where it gets lost. It's kind of hard to know everything.
And there's kind of we don't necessarily need to either, right? I mean, like I can pull up Google Maps. I mean, there's surveying is still important. There's advanced mapping and geographic things that need to still happen, but understanding how something would have happened for the normal person, 170 years ago, I suppose doesn't really have a huge impact. I mean, it's interesting, but you're right. I mean, I can get away with, the modern ways of getting around and finding where I am and stuff. But it is interesting nonetheless to learn about how it used to be done, how it's in many ways still done.
Yeah, I mean, and it's still the border today, like
exactly.
We're still living with it, it's weird to think that, there was a time when, there was Minnesota wasn't a state, and like these borders were still being determined and, like how do you determine those things? That's why I was interested in like, how did they decide to have a 40-mile stretch of just straight line? Like that just seems random to me, but there's a different time and different thought process,
Right. Yeah. And I think going back to that error, from what I understand, the points are all right, but I think the distance between the two are wrong. And so people were able to kind of still get around it. Like it didn't actually impact, going out and having to recreate a survey or from what I understand, it didn't actually, for some reason, even though being off, or missing 3,000 feet somehow didn't really mess things up for people. They just kind of worked around it, is what I'm understanding. But I think I'm going to leave that to Tony.
Yeah, leave it to the experts.
Yeah.
All right, Jimmy. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you again so much for joining us. Maybe in another 36 episodes, we'll find a different part of the border that's weird. We can figure out what's going on there. Maybe the Canadian border. Maybe we can see how the other half lives up there in terms of that border. But that sounds like it'd probably be more of a complicated situation. With it's a different country.
Right. Yeah, a little more difficult to get over there.
Yeah, that too. Maybe after Bear Grease. After Bear Grease. And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. Next week, Jay Gabler and I venture to Cane Lakes Candies in Virginia to see the Dayton figures they have given a second life to. You can find all the episodes of Northlandia on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you or someone you know has a unique story that you believe could have a place here in Northlandia, let us know by emailing northlandia@duluthnewstribune.com. Join us again next week and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss if you're not in the right place at the right time, right to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.